known Roosevelt. In fact, he went to school with Roosevelt. Roosevelt was 2 years behind him at Groton and at Harvard. And Roosevelt asked that Grew remain as ambassador in Japan. And he every year when Roosevelt was reelected, which would be in 1936 and again in 1940, Roosevelt again asked that Grew remain there as America's envoy to Japan. And so here was a man who was, very experienced in diplomatic matters. He had, in fact, been the first secretary in the American embassy in Berlin during the First World War. So he had experience in dealing with countries who were at war with the United States. And so he was very interested. He saw his mission as preserving good relations or harmonious relations between Japan and the United States. And that's what he did. He said he could never give up. And when he was questioned about that, he saw that relations between the United States and Japan were deteriorating rapidly in the fall of 1941. And as I told you, he sent a telegram to Hull warning him about Japan's willingness to launch a suicidal war against the United States. But Grew never gave up. He told the Congressional Committee after the war that giving up, he likened himself to a political candidate who knows he's going to be defeated on Election Day. He said, you can never give up. He said a Foreign Service officer who gives up because it's inevitable is a disservice to the government. And he did not intend to be a disservice to the government. So he was going to do everything he could for as long as he could to try and work something out. And that's what he did. He kept talking to people in Japan, kept communicating to Cordell Hull and Franklin Roosevelt back in the United States, trying to do what he could to orchestrate an agreement that would avoid the war that he saw coming.
What sort of agreement was he trying to work out in an alternate history where World War II is avoided? How would he see things being agreed upon between Japan and the United States?
Well, his principal recommendation toward the end, right before Pearl Harbor, concerned a request from the Japanese Prime Minister, a gentleman known, his name was Konie Fumimaro. But anyhow, the Japanese Prime Minister, this was a Japanese Prime Minister who was well regarded by all factions of Japanese society, both those who wanted some agreement with the United States and even some who did not. But the Prime Minister came to Grew, and he requested a dinner with Grew. And he said to him, look, I was Prime Minister, he said, when Japan started its war against China in 1937. And he said that war is still going on. Hundreds of thousands of casualties that Japan had incurred. And he felt very bad about the fact that the war in China was still going on and that it was no closer to a resolution. And he said, I do not want to see any war with the United States. And what he said was he was prepared to come to American soil. First he proposed Hawaii, and Roosevelt then proposed Juneau, Alaska. And he said he wanted to meet with Roosevelt, and he wanted to have an agreement. He said he was prepared to accept basically whatever terms Roosevelt wanted within reason, so to avoid the war. And so Grew said that Roosevelt should meet with the Prime Minister because he was very anxious, the Prime Minister was very anxious, to reach some kind of agreement that would enable the two countries to avoid war.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. Were there any points of no return that you could identify in Grew's personal diaries or correspondence where he knew that war was now inevitable?
I think the short answer to your question is yes, there was a point. And that point came when Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, gave the Japanese representatives, finally, they had been clamoring for months for some specification of the terms that the United States wanted in any agreement. And so Hull finally gave the Japanese representatives a detailed proposal on November 26, 1941. And as I said, it was a proposal that had exceeded anything, in many respects, the terms that Hull had been discussing with the Japanese representatives in months before. And it was also something that Hull knew the Japanese would never accept. And the Japanese regarded it as a sign of bad faith because after all this time, Hull finally gave them something that went far beyond or was very different from what they had been discussing previously. So, and not completely, but in some respects. But when Grew saw that proposal, which was Hull sent the proposal to Grew after he had given it to the Japanese. When Hull and his staff saw that proposal, they knew that there was no turning back, that the prospect of war was almost certain. So, and that was probably, they probably got it on November 27, 1941. But notwithstanding that, Grew tried to tell the Japanese representatives with whom he was in contact that this was a good faith proposal, that it offered a basis to avoid war. So he did his duty as America's representative to try to get the Japanese to accept it as a basis for negotiation. But even though he did that, in his heart he knew that it was a turning point and that the end was near.
What were the terms? Oh, sorry. Go
I'll
ahead.
give you just one little story about that. Is that Grew and the embassy counselor, a guy named Gene Duman, they were going, as I say, they were going around where they could to talk to the Japanese representatives. And one of the places they would go would be the Tokyo Club. And the Tokyo Club was a place in Tokyo, obviously, where Japanese representatives, government, and people of high stature in Japan would meet with and socialize with the foreign community, American diplomats and diplomats from other countries. And so it was a place where people could go and have conversation at the highest levels. And so Grew and Duman had scheduled a meeting with some influential Japanese person at the Tokyo Club. And this was on the Friday before, so this would have been on Friday, December 5th. And when they got to the Tokyo Club, and they were waiting for this Japanese gentleman, and he showed up, and he said, "I have just heard something that has made me sick, and I'm going home and going to bed." And he left. So that was some indication that the conflict that they anticipated, that something was going down and it was not good.
What were the terms that Hull laid out that made it very clear that the U.S. wasn't interested in negotiating with Japan?
Well, I'll give you two examples. Japan had established a puppet regime in Manchuria, and they called it Manchukuo. And there was a lot of discussion. Manchuria is an area that was rich in natural resources and it has a long history. And that was very important for the Japanese to be able to maintain an economic relationship in Manchuria. And they had troops there and had troops there for many, many years. In all the discussions that they had between Hull and the Japanese representatives beginning in the spring of 1941 through the fall of 1941, there was always an issue about whether or not the Japanese would be allowed to maintain troops in Manchuria and northern China. And Hull's response, he understood that this was an issue that had to be dealt with separately, and he would always say, "Listen, we're going to deal with that issue separately. That's not going to be part of any agreement that we do now. We'll reach an agreement on other issues, and we'll deal with Manchuria later." When Hull gave them this, and so that's the Japanese understood was Hull's position, that they didn't have to worry about that now. When he gave them this proposal, it was called the Hull Note, on November 26th, it required that all Japanese troops leave China, including Manchuria. And so the Japanese were kind of surprised at that because it was an issue that Hull had said would not be resolved now, and now he was suddenly saying that they had to remove all their troops from Manchuria. So that was one issue. The other issue, one other point, concerned agreements. Remember, the Japanese and the United States have been talking for 8 months almost about a bilateral agreement between the United States and Japan, and they were getting nowhere. They were not even close to having an agreement. And in fact, apropos of that, Hull said that the purpose of the discussions was to see if there was a basis for conducting the negotiations. And he said, we are not conducting negotiations now. All we're doing is having discussions, Hull said, to see if we can enter into negotiations. So given all this, they, when Hull gave them this proposal in November 1941, it required 2 separate multilateral agreements that would involve not only Japan and the United States, but many other countries, Great Britain, the Netherlands, and even the Soviet Union and other countries, with respect to a variety of matters. So when the Japanese looked at that they said, we're not even getting anywhere with the United States in reaching a bilateral agreement. Now, one of the conditions of the Hull note is for us to enter into multilateral agreements that will involve not only the United States, but other countries as well. And they said, can you imagine the amount of time it would take to negotiate multilateral agreements that involve other countries? So they said, this is not anything that's going to happen soon. And against this backdrop, I go back to the economic sanctions. The Japanese economy was crippled. So just to give you a few examples, there was no gasoline available for cars, so that there were almost no cars in the streets of Tokyo. And the few cars there were fitted with charcoal engines. Rice was being rationed. Metal was not available for consumer goods. Even coffee, they had no imported coffee. They had some other blend of some other drink as a substitute for coffee, about which the New York Times correspondent said was better not to ask too many questions. So you have this situation where the Japanese economy is crippled, and they're looking for they've been talking with the United States for many months, and now they get this proposal that they see is only going to drag the conversations out that much longer. So, and Hull understood that this proposal was not going to be well received in Japan.
Were there things that stuck out to you when you were both looking at Gru's personal accounts, but you also spoke with his family and staff to try to understand the struggle to prevent the attacks? Were there any interesting things about the story that came out to you in your correspondence with them?
In terms of his family, the only thing that, again, I was talking to members of Gru's family and the family members of his staff, all of whom, of course, are gone. The one thing that came across in talking to members of Gru's family, well, 2 things, I should say. One is that he did not like Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and he felt Hull was a very inflexible, cautious decision maker. And the other thing was that, which goes hand in hand with that perspective, is that Gru was very bitter when Pearl Harbor occurred, because he felt that the president, and especially Hull, had just completely ignored him and had lost whatever chance. He didn't know, of course, there was no guarantee in this business. He didn't know if he could avoid war, but he certainly wanted to try, and he felt that Hull's approach had foreclosed any chance to avoid the war. And so later, in fact, Gru would say that the American policy in the final months before Pearl Harbor was completely inflexible, and that reporting to our government, from his perspective, was like throwing pebbles into a lake at night.
So what happened with Grew after the Pearl Harbor attacks? Did he continue in the diplomatic corps